Hey folks, it's Nate. It's time I got back to the drawing board, and tonight we are going to look at Downcast, written by Clint Stoker with art by Ignacio Lazaro. Okay, I hope I said that right. Um, Colors by Damian Penalba, and letters by Eric Weather. So this is actually a two-part book, and I am going to look at these two together. And there's a very specific reason for that, which we'll talk about when we get to the story part. But first, I want to talk about the other two parts of this review, which is the form factor and the art. And on form factor front, this is a pretty typical square-bound trade paperback style comic book. It is it's pretty good quality. It's about what you would expect. The only really thing that's off, and not in a bad way necessarily, is the texture of the pages is a little bit different from your typical super glossy comic trade paperback, and I actually like that a little bit. There's a little more substance to this. It feels a little more like art paper as opposed to magazine paper. I suppose whether you like that more or less is going to be probably mostly a matter of taste. Personally, I found it to be appealing. Uh, let's talk about the art. Ignacio is, I don't know if he is a professional comic artist or if this was his first professional comic, but he has a number of things going for him in here. The first and the biggest is he makes great compositions. He does a lot of cool things with the composition of his pages. There's a lot of verticality in Downcast, a lot of ups and downs, and he does a lot of cool stuff with these long, skinny panels that make for interesting and engaging action sequences. There's a lot of small or large breakouts in panels, like you can see here. We see Jackson, his head is kind of outside of the panel, and the rope goes through this other panel. That does a great job of leading the eye, of creating some visual interest. He has a great command of bodies in motion. All of these are really great things. On the other hand, Ignacio's style is not particularly detailed. He has some hatching, some cross hatching, and of course in shots like here with the rope, he does a pretty good job. But in terms of people's faces and bodies, there's not a whole lot of sculpting or defining or cross hatching a lot of the time. And that is, I think, more a stylistic choice as opposed to an artistic choice, or excuse me, as opposed to a reflection of his skill level. So it's an artist's choice as um, opposed to my saying that Ignacio is a bad artist. He's a very good artist, and I think he has previous comics experience. That is my intuition based on what I'm seeing here, because he does have a good command of a lot of the things that you would want, like this panel of this guy getting knocked out of the window. Look at that. That is a great action panel. But it is a very different style than the typical Western superhero comic or your typical manga. This is a very Euro feel, a very bande dessinée, if I said that right, kind of a feel. Actually, I haven't read a whole lot of that, so I can't say for sure. But it does put me in the mind of what I've seen of European comics. And I like it. It's a very distinct style, and I think being distinct is better than being technically proficient, but samey when compared to the rest of the market. So on the whole, I appreciate Mr. Lazaro's work, but I understand that it may not be to everyone's taste. Um, so on the whole, I would give this art, a strong thumbs up, a strong recommend. At the same time, if what you're seeing here doesn't appeal to you, I totally understand it. You should know that it doesn't really, there's not an appreciable change between volumes. And this is another thing that makes me think that Ignacio is an experienced comic artist. I would expect an unexperienced person to have grown quite a bit over the course of these two volumes. And frankly, I don't think he really needed to grow a whole lot. I think he had an idea of what he wanted his style in the story to be, and he executed on it very well. So again, I think the art in these books is really a matter of taste. That said, if it isn't to your taste, I can understand you're not checking this book out on account of that. So the real question is, if you're on the fence about the art, what does the story have to offer you to push you one way or the other? And let's dig into that. And we're going to talk about both books because these two books together are one story. That is to say, as far as I can tell, based on what I've read, and I don't follow Clint Stoker online, I don't follow his YouTube channel, so I don't know a whole lot about what his plans for the future are, but it really seems to me like he's done with Downcast. And that is actually, in my opinion, a really good thing. I believe stories need beginnings and endings. And so far, I haven't heard a lot about most indie comics projects having an endpoint in mind. The only example I can think of is Ethan Van Sciver's Cyberfrog, which he said he wants to be 4 volumes. And I think that's really important to give people a satisfying experience with their story. It needs a beginning, it needs a middle, it needs an end. And, well, I take that back. Earthbound by Narwhal, who, full disclosure, many of you know I stream with him on occasion, and we are working on projects together. His Earthbound project and Foreign Agent both have fixed lengths. Earthbound is 2 volumes, and Foreign Agent was 1. And I know the project, one of the projects we're working on is a standalone volume, and the other, Modded, has a projected endpoint. Whether we'll get there or not will depend probably a lot on your interest as the audience. But anyways, I really am not a believer in perpetual ongoing stories that just drag themselves out with constant new story threads and story arcs, and really often, in my opinion, end when they've worn out their welcome. That is, in my opinion, not a good way to make stories. So congratulations to Clint. He did a full story, and he had a specific outcome in mind, and he got there. And he did a pretty good job of it. As far as the writing goes, there are no plot holes or major inconsistencies. The dialogue is, in my opinion, quite good. So what is the story? And I'm going to give you a 100-mile overview of the story, just so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about when I start to talk about what I liked and what I didn't like. And the story basically is about brother and sister, and they are Joe, the girl, and Jax, the boy. And I believe Joe is the older one. It's been a while since I read this, so and I didn't have time to completely refresh my memory, so I just kind of skimmed through both volumes before doing this. And I apologize if I get any details wrong. I had meant to do this as one of my first 2 reviews back when I started doing reviews again, but then Bigfoot Bill arrived, and it dropped like everything out of my head, and so it took a while to get here. So Joe is, I believe, the older of the 2 siblings, and they live in a flying city. And props right there. I love flying cities. Flying stuff is cool, but flying cities are especially cool. Things to keep in mind for the future, folks. And on this flying city, there is some kind of an artifact, which is this glowing orb here, that keeps the city in the air. And the city has been put in the air because Earth is largely a wasteland, and the people who run the city exiled Joe and Jax's father to the ground for some kind of an accident in the past. They're trying to clear his name. And at the same time, a leader of the city, who's known as Senator Rise, is trying to capture this orb for a mysterious entity called Mother. It's unclear whether Mother is a real person or whether she exists exclusively in Rise's head. But he basically leads a kind of a death cult that's trying to grab this orb and purge the city of Strata so that only the faithful live there. And yeah, it's pretty typical death cult kind of stuff. It's either purge the unjust or bring about the end of the world, and we have scenario A here. Nothing really to complain about. There's not a whole lot of the way in twists and turns, I guess. Joe and Jax wind up with this orb, and they start to piece together Senator Rise's conspiracy. They team up with a journalist to expose him and hopefully eventually clear their father. And then in the second volume, Rise is exposed, and he's taken from power, and they're trying to clear their father, but Rise breaks out, and basically, and this is one of the weaknesses of the story. We get a rehash of a second confrontation between the cult and Rise and Joe and Jax. And they do clear their father. They actually go back down to Earth and they find him there and they bring him back to Strata. And they do eventually clear his name, and Rise is dealt with. And eventually they go back to being window washers, which I thought was a really interesting job for them to do. Really emphasizes visually the verticality of the whole city. So with that 1,000-mile thumbnail look at what happened, what is good and what is bad about this story? Well, let's start with some of the good stuff, which is Joe and Jax themselves are very believable siblings. They're well written. They have strong motivations. They have a set of skills which is in alignment with their position. So like they are window washers, but they know a lot about climbing up and down and getting around safely in this very vertical place where most of the comic plays out. Because when they get the orb, I guess I should say a word about the orb. The orb is what keeps Strata in the air. I don't know if I said that earlier, but that's what it does. And it has some kind of control over gravity, so they can use it to mess with gravity. And there's a lot of really cool visual tricks they do with that. And yeah, again, props to Ignacio for illustrating that so well. And I assume Clint wrote at least the broad strokes of this action, and it's very inventive. So props to him there as well. And so you have the action, you have the central characters, and you have Rise. And Rise is he's a tricky character to praise because he is very stereotypical. He is the deranged cult leader with a position of power, and he, has his own goals, which seem to be driven by madness, but could also be driven by, actual exposure to this orb and its anti-gravity powers, and that's never clearly explained. However, Rise is a very well-written stereotypical character. That is to say, it never feels like he's walked out of central casting. He does always feel like an integral part of this world, at least to me. And that is very praiseworthy. It's good to be able to take a character type that we all know already and keep us, invested in him, as Clint has done here. And that is an achievement. I just don't think that Rise does anything. He is an antagonist, and that's all he really is. And you can have stories that just have antagonists that are kind of flat and one note. And I think he's a good example of that. I don't know, as he really feels like he plays well with the rest of the story. Maybe he does. Let's talk a little bit about the things I don't like about Downcast. And what I don't like about Downcast the most is I have very little appreciation for how we got where we are or where we're going to go later. And I mean, we know personally Joe and Jax's father was implicated in a massive accident which caused him to lose his job and be banished from the city. Okay. But we don't know how the city got in the air exactly. We don't know what happened to the earth that turned it into a wasteland. We don't know, how anti-gravity was discovered. The city is full of flying cars, so it seems to be very common. Jax seems to know a fair amount about messing with it. He's the one who harnesses the orb and gets it to do most of the stuff it needs to do. So, I have questions about that. I have questions about this cult that Rise is the leader of. Like, have they always existed and he just came to power and was the most bonkers? Or did he found them himself? Was there some other group of people who picked him to be the leader of this cult because he had political influence? All of that is very confusing to me, and I'd like to see it explained. There is a section at the end of Volume 2 called A Complete History of Strata, and there's a lot of interesting world building stuff in here. But I didn't get any of it from the story itself, and I think that, like, I'm not a fan of having to go into an appendix to get this kind of picture of, the world at large. I would have liked the story itself to give me a little more insight. And so I think that's the biggest part that I don't like about Downcast. I really feel like the world building, the story world building, not the visual world building, which is very strong. I have an idea of what things look like in this world and a pretty good idea of why they look that way, but I don't know how things got this way. I don't know much about the history. I don't know much about the people in general. I don't even have a really good idea what the people of Strata think about living in Strata. Do they like it? Do they not like it? Like, to bring in another story, and this isn't an entirely fair comparison because there was a lot more pages to work with in it, but in Battle Angel, when Alita goes to Zalem, we learn a lot about Zalem society in a very short period of time. The people there are the Walking Dead, really. They have very little in the way of free will. There's a public suicide booth, which seems to be used quite a bit based on the way it looks when we finally see the insides. I would have liked to have a better idea of what life in Strata is like in general, and a better idea of what life on the surface is like, just so we understand some of the stakes, like what does it really mean to be exiled from Strata. All of these were aspects that are only hinted at in the story itself and really could have been expanded better. That said, the central conflict is quite strong. Rise is a good antagonist, even if that's all he really ever is in the course of the story. And Joe and Jax's conflicts with him are creative, they're inventive. It requires the heroes to be clever, as well as skilled or powerful to overcome him. He knows a lot more about the world, and he leverages that knowledge against them constantly. I just wish we got some better insight into the things that drove Rise and the status of the world in general. All in all, this is not a bad first effort at storytelling. So the question then becomes, do I recommend it? Well, I don't have a straightforward answer to this one, actually. Because there's a lot of different elements that would lead me to recommend it or not to recommend it. So let's break it down and look at it from a couple of different angles. If you like the art, and there's a lot to like in Ignacio Lazaro's art, I would definitely buy it, and buy it in this format. Something that will really let you open up and appreciate the glossy pages and the clean lines and the well-executed colors. If you don't like the look of the art, but you like action-adventure stories, this is still a good buy. But I don't know if I would buy it in this format. I might look into buying it from Alterna Comics instead. Their newsprint editions are pretty cheap, and I believe I understand correctly that it is coming out as a single volumes in newsprint. So that might be the better way for you to experience Downcast. If you don't like the look of the art, if you would like something with a slicker style, if you want something with heavier blacks or more polished line work, with stronger high contrast colors, you might look into Fatal, F-A-T-L, which is also done by Clint Stoker, but has a different artist and is very much more in the superheroic style that many Western comic connoisseurs are accustomed to. That looks like a project that has going to have art that appeals to you a lot more. If you are looking for a sci-fi story with strong world building that deeply plays into the themes of the core conflict, I would recommend against Downcast, because that is not what this is. This isn't an action-adventure story with a sci-fi skin on it that makes a lot of the action sequences easier to buy into, and it's very good at doing that. It is not a hardcore sci-fi tale, and if you come here to read that, I think you're going to be disappointed. There were some add-ons that came with this. I don't actually have them here. That's my bad. There was a patch and some stickers, so my unused patch collection grows. I'm very happy to report. And of course, if you're a sticker person, if you like to put them on your binders or your laptop cases or something like that, you will get a Sweetcast Comics sticker to do. You can do that with, or whatever it is you do with stickers. I don't really understand the sticker phenomenon, so there's that. There are some bookmarks, which are kind of a mainstay giveaway. I don't use bookmarks. I tend to read these all in one sitting. But yeah, if you want bookmarks to mark your book while you're reading it, they come as well. All in all, for what I paid for this, I think it's a pretty good investment. But again, the core part, the story and art of Downcast itself, you're going to have to seriously ask yourself what you want before you can know if this is something that is going to float your boat. And, on the whole, I'm pretty glad I have this. It's a nice product. It's a fun story, and I am very heartened to see that at least a couple of authors are looking at putting solid endings on their stories. And I'm looking forward to Clint's next project. But this one I can recommend only with a lot of caveats. And you know what? I don't think that's necessarily bad. Targeted genre fiction has its place in the market. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, there's a like button and subscribe button down below. You can use them as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.